the True Dante. What follows is an examination of the central canto of the comedy, the Commedia, Purgatory XVII, though it is best to begin from the end of 16, for all canti are tied together. There is a kind of chain that allows us to move from one canto to another. A prefatory remark: the reading that is offered here sheds light on the true Dante, who has been obscured by centuries of modern scholarship. The reading that follows will show that the main lessons that have been taught about Dante, that we have received, are wrong, off the mark. They have contributed to obscuring Dante, his work, his message. Modern scholarship has been critical in the modern sense of the term, and because of that, it has missed the point. It has failed miserably to understand Dante, his logos, his discourse, his telos, where he's going. In general, people have upheld a Dante who is a pious choir boy from the Middle Ages, somebody who subsumes philosophy under theological authority. Then we've had a wave of scholarship that has seen Dante as a precursor of modernity, somebody who is opposed to Christianity, at least between the lines. And from here we have a Machiavellian reading of Dante as someone who was really out to subvert Christianity altogether and return to a kind of Epicureanism that was heretical in the Middle Ages. Dante as an Averroes. We even have, of course, well, for those who are familiar with the scholarship, Dante the Islamist, so the philo-Muslim. Well, I've done what I could in the past in writing, written publications, in vocal recordings, right, interviews and whatnot, to explain how, why modern scholarship has failed miserably to, well, introduce us to Dante. The lesson that follows, the reading that follows, speaks for itself. Purgatory, Purgatorio XVI, closes with a reference to the remnant of the effaced people, la gente spenta, where spingere is from the Latin pingere, or pingere in the medieval pronunciation. What about this remnant? It is a remnant in the present savage century, secolo selvaggio. In our century, in our savage century, this remnant can be seen only in a secretive, illuminating speech pointing to a heavenly God known by Dante. This is what we learn at the end of Purgatory 16, if we have ears to hear. Purgatory 17, Purgatorio, opens with the juxtaposition between an ascent to the sun and a digging marked respectively by the Alps and moles. The digging is only superficially blind, for in light of an ascent, the digger sees past mere appearances. Dante's invitation to the reader is to recall how the sun cuts through the humid and thick vapors to raise our sight to the image of a sun discerned just before it disappears. However, now the sun is met through poetry or Virgil, or on a classical, poetic, time-defying ascent. Yet, sometimes poetry is so efficacious that it makes us forgetful of the music informing our vision. The poetic music moves the reader to rise above all appearances, to see through hearing, as it were, and thus to understand, to see in the element of reflection. In this context are we to read Dante's subsequent verses. A lamp moves you that takes shape in the sky by itself or by a will that escorts it below. Muoviti lume che nel ciel s'informa per sé o per voler che giù lo scorge. Just as Virgil moves Dante's avatar, so does Dante move his reader, whether or not poetry is escorted by its heavenly guise. In the present case, poetic speech impinges upon the pilgrim's mind, driving it to produce an image of otherwise invisible qualities such as wrath. Incidentally, here, scholars, Hollanders, one of the most prestigious ones today, are wrong in assuming that Dante is speaking of gods inspiring the poet's imagination. But we will see further why they're completely wrong. We learn here of the invisible through poetry, which allows us to see savage things, personified here by vengeful Procne, as undergoing a metamorphosis into mirrors of poetry itself, whereby we could say that everything we imagine is shaped by poetry. Hence Dante's indication that nothing, here we're quoting, nothing comes from without his mind that was not at once received by her. Di fuor non venia cosa che fosse allor da lei ricetta. What the mind compressed, ristretta, by poetic speech receives is its own product. Yet, the mind can be so impressed by its own images that it can impute them to a source transcending it, the mind. Hence, the poi, then, of verse 25, which introduces a crucified one who reigned within the lofty imagination, piove dentro all'alta fantasia, dying out, disdainful and fierce in his view, dispettoso e fiero nella sua vista. Once again, vision appears at the sunset of life, or in dying. The crucified vision of the lofty imagination is not, however, that of Christ, but of Haman, a villain from the book of Esther, representing now a revolt against death itself, a revolt that comes to fruition in poetry alone, as opposed to savage wrath, no matter of what provenance, human or divine. Even biblical heroism fails to do justice to man's will to defy death. Accordingly, around Haman, the crucified, stand three biblical figures: the great Ahasuerus, Esther, his wife, and righteous Mordecai. This is Dante's writing. In Mordecai, in whom Ahasuerus' doings, his far, and Esther's speech, her dire, are integrated. Thus, così, or as in an ephemeral, insubstantial bubble. Una bulla cui manca l'acqua sotto qual si feo. A fleeting illusion of the imagination that is real only in speech, where lack of feo, done, points back to the far that Mordecai appeared to have reconciled with a dire, a saying. In sum, what the lofty imagination beholds as crucified is not the Christ, but a villain, and what it beholds as virtue is but an illusion. Yet, we learn something significant from the illusion, insofar as its disappearance yields the image of a pagan failure to overcome alienation between name and deed, as between, who we are nominally and our being transported in our deeds. Hence Dante's references to Princess Lavinia and her suicidal mother, who had, quote, out of ire wanted to be not, per ira voluto esser nulla, in the respect that she had sought the completion of speech, hence the dire her daughter is left with, in a will that would prove suicidal. Now you have lost me, ormai perduta, cries out the daughter, who is left with speech alone, implicitly reminding us that our own ephemeral visions are shaped by a speech alienated from deeds, and so by empty promises resulting from a suicidal will that seeks in itself as will its own perfection. When then Lavinia refers to a double ruin, alla tua pria ch'all'altrui ruina, she is not merely speaking of her mother's killing herself in the flesh, as modern commentators have concluded, but to her ruining deeds on the way to bringing about the ruin of speech. So here we're dealing with the alienation between the two. What is ruined is the unity of speech and deed that the imagination can grasp fleetingly when exposed to the Bible. Yet, it is the vision of ruin that shakes us out of our dream that all is well, driving our imagination to fall. Così l'imaginar mio cadde giuso, says Dante, lest we fall entirely into despair, he adds, losing all hope in a solar reconciliation between words and deeds, where we have a pun in the word spera, right? Spera del sol, the sphere of the sun, where spera can also indicate hope. Yet again, the vision that awakes Dante's avatar, so Dante in the poem, in the comedy, is moved by a poetic lamp, a lume, that is substantially greater than the one we're used to, maggior assai che quel che è nostro uso, recalling Dante's earlier reference to our savage century. So, it is Dante's unusual Virgilian lamp. Later in Purgatory, we will find the Roman carrying a physical one behind his back, and thus not for himself, that draws his attention to his context, or the nature of the place where he had been dreaming, namely the poetic ascent, evoked by a voice distracting him now from any other pursuit. That same voice prepares the listener to steadfastly want to reconsider who it was that was speaking, di riguardar chi era che parlava, focused upon coming face to face with that someone. Yet again, the pilgrim's virtue or strength of mind falls short of facing his moving lamp in unmediated fashion, for he can see the Son of the self-concealing Holy Ghost, Spirito Santo, only through Virgil's words. To see the lamp directly as a someone would be to remain blinded by a solar illusion. Vision of our true mover we can enjoy only through or in good or properly poetic speech, in the absence of which we are doomed to ire in the face of failure to see what moves us. And here there's another pun in Dante where ir can mean go, but also ira. Poetry would then be our only true antidote against ire, given frustration of our desire to see what moves us. So we get angry because we can't see what moves us. Through poetry, the hidden what that moves us turns into a who, a manifest person in whom word and deed are fully one. In such a poetic person, Mordecai finds his non-disappointing realization. And of course, traditionally, Mordecai is almost a prelude, right? He intimates the coming of Christ. Poetry shows us that the spirit that moves us does not respond to our prayers or our will, but remains secretly at work in our own work, uopo in Dante, so that it does not negate deeds with words imposed upon them from without. The attempt to complete works or deeds with words applied to them from without is essentially evil, or the result of a mind fallen into evil, hence Dante's malignamente. Words would then negate deeds as a matter of principle, while purporting to complete them. Yet, how are we to avoid falling prey of the voluntarist habit of using speech to complete deeds? Countering an earlier pria, or prior, now we find an evocation of a Virgilian sun or lamp, inviting the reader or the pilgrim to find the foot, the piede, of poetic virtue, prior to the sun's darkening, pria che s'abbui, leaving open the possibility that poetry is well suited to guide us, even where a higher will were to leave us in the dark, or prior to that will's return. For then, poetry's classical lamp would provide the only passage through which our mind could rise out of darkness. Che poi non si poria, se il dì non riede, where poria is a pun on por, from poros, right? Whence we have aporia. And poi, or then, as suggesting that without entering into the night through poetry, we cannot ascend to the highest good. Duke Virgil's own saying, Virgil is called Duca, which means leader. So Duke Virgil's own saying, or dire, is then, or Dante says così, one that enters into the dark by way of raising us to the light, our first motor, instead of imposing words upon our labor. Our labor is to ascend. As if we were originally moved by words alone. The ascent can then be gradual, as on a ladder of illumination, where the pilgrim senses the movement of spirit in his vision, blessing those who, not moved by malignant ire, do not seek war against a higher will. Thus it is that classical poetry allows us to sense the Holy Ghost, the Spirito Santo, as divinely hidden spirit, at work in our own vision of things on our path to full understanding or illumination. Dante's ascent, or our own, points beyond the dying present, the already, the già, recurrent throughout our canto. The dying present is the night that pursues the last rays that should remind us of the effaced people, the gente spenta, of Canto 16, as well as the night filled with religious fear, la notte che passai con tanta pietà, evoked in the first canto of Inferno. There, already, we find a call to flee darkness through poetic guidance, confronting the passage, the passo of death in the element of reflection. The ascent, as we learn already in the first canto of Inferno, proceeds through a descent, or reflection upon the ascent itself, the deed, our own labor. The labor itself tires us down, inviting a rest to be filled with reflection, as on the Sabbath. Accordingly, now we find that, given the pilgrim's power's deficiency, his ladder no longer ascended, forcing him to stay, even though poetry's paternal discourse, sermone, could proceed to illuminate the nature of the labor at hand. The immediate context is that of purgation, restoring the duty of the love of the good, l'amor del bene, that is, of the good of the intellect, il ben dell'intelletto, that we have already found in Inferno, Canto 3. The duty that encourages us to pursue a precise understanding of the good itself, fails regularly without reflection inspired or guided by poetry. Thanks to poetry, our love restores itself, regaining a sense of its righteousness, its being on the right path, its way being diritta, suggested by the quirita of Purgatory 17, verses 85 or so, which evokes the diritta via of the first canto of Inferno. Now, by turning towards his poetic father, Virgil, the pilgrim is to seize some good fruit, he says, qualche buon frutto, found in the place of rest from labor. Not a forbidden fruit, to be sure. Evidently, the fruit in question is a legitimate sign of the nature of the good we love by nature, thus not per se an idol. Right? And so, a sign of a mind unfettered by any illusion. Virgil's reminder is that love is naturally or necessarily good and unerring, though the will, the animo, may err due to an ill object, malo obietto. So he doesn't have things in focus, which is to say, an object distorted by excess or deficiency of vigor. It is not enough to pursue the object of love. One must learn to pursue it reflectively, given our natural limitations. When lacking vigor, we must rest, rather than follow ire, resenting our natural limitations. Those who are enraged against God are best advised to rest and reflect upon the true nature of the object of their desire, lest they conceive that object as alien or opaque to thought, in which case they would tend to pursue it through deeds alone, deeds devoid of thought, and upon which words would be then applied from without, as if words alone could compensate our loss of pure reflection. All is fine, and indeed all pleasure, diletto, is good, as long as our desire is directed towards the first good, primo ben, this being the good itself, or the infinite perfection necessarily presupposed by our finite mind. And as long as our desire measures itself, se stesso misura, in secondary goods, which is to say that man serves as the measure of all goods, falling short of the first. Here, man's finite mind measures the distance between God's mind and all other objects of our desire. To understand such secondary, secundi, goods, we need to see them in the element of reflection, recognizing how our desire delimits its objects in opposition to the supreme good. On our day of rest, or in peace, we are to purge our objects of desire of a will falling short of God's own hidden one, the divine will being hidden in the divine intellect. Here, our desire is free from the compulsion to seek solutions outside of mind. Naturally, we are called to seek a good beyond our mind, but we encounter such a good in signs inspired by poetry, signs helping us reflect or purge our will of its earthly bonds. It follows that the ascent to a transcendent good coincides with a purgatorial descent of the finite mind, mind as predicate, into itself. Classical poetry's primary role is to facilitate such a descent for us, especially insofar as we remain lost in a savage century. Virgil's reminder is finally that our desire freezes, imploding as a suicidal will, where it does not run into the good, corre nel bene, with a moderation ratified as duty by Christianity. Those who oppose Christianity tend to lose the moderation it ratifies, ending up with a desire that twists itself to evil. Al mal si torce. Accordingly, Virgil advises his student that he is capable of understanding that it is fitting for love to be in us the seed of every virtue and of every deed that merits punishment. Quinci comprender puoi, ch'esser convene amor sementa in voi d'ogni virtute et d'ogni operazion che merta pene. The power, the possa, that the pilgrim lacked prior to poetry's encouragement is in him to discern the reasonableness of Christian authority, which presents our love, desire of the good as our foremost duty, with the understanding that we are not to navigate with oars opposed to nature's currents, but supported, this is how we are to proceed, supported by a wind or a spirit hidden in nature's pristine bosom. Virgil's argument unfolds as a defense of love, which is naturally directed to what is good or complete in everything subject to it, suo subietto, whereby things are guarded, tute, from the Latin tueor, we find in Dante. They're guarded against hate. There is something rightly lovable in all objects of desire, something preserving poetry's own words from falling into the savage hands of poetry's hateful detractors, something in which we see ourselves or what belongs to us. Furthermore, since everything we love presupposes its rootedness in a first beloved substance, hate is inconsequential with respect to God. For while in words we might hate God, indeed, we love God implicitly by loving anything at all. In short, we can hate nothing absolutely, and in all things we cannot help loving God. The defense of love, Virgil's defense of love, ends with a consideration of the possibility that we desire evil for our neighbor in our lime or earthly nature. Whether by our seeking our own excellence in his debasement or suppression, as we might say today, his canceling, or by our fearing to lose power, grace, honor, and fame, says Dante, relatively to him, or by our craving vengeance for an evil our neighbor would have inflicted upon us, in which case we would seek to rid ourselves of a mark, an impronta, in Dante, left upon us. The three cases in question correspond formally to pride, envy, and wrath, which presuppose a threefold love, triforme amor. Hate being a repressed love, of course. Yet another corrupt love is left to account fully for our hate. Again, hate as ultimately our failure to love fully. A weak love, lento amore, or desire, to see the good we otherwise apprehend confusedly in all things, or to acquire the good we painfully witness after just repentance, dopo giusto penter vene martyra, entails another good that does not make man happy, a pleasure alienated from the primary good, and to which is associated the vice of sloth, unnamed here so that the student may seek it for himself. The problem, once again, is lack of measure or corrupt order, ordine corrotto. Though here we are dealing more precisely with an excessive abandoning of oneself, troppo s'abbandona, says Dante, to a secondary form of desire, a derivative good, the good being the form of desire. To indulge in such a good would be to partake idolatrously in its vacuity, its dying out into utter darkness. Sloth, acedia in Latin, emerges as the textual midpoint of Dante's comedy. There, we're in verses 124-25, as capital enemy of a vigorous, unflinching desire of a good we encounter strictly through systematic poetic purgation, which, as we have seen, involves a reflective dialectic of deed and speech. Through such a journey of reflection alone can we regain the dignity making us worthy of communing with the good itself.